Chapter 15, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 15, Our Enemies Bring Us Together. Part 1, Victory Bay, Kronus. The propaganda department lieutenant was young, eager, and likely as crazy as the Lord Inquisitor. In Vale's case, it was understandable. He had been to hell and back over the past couple of weeks. They faced a great demon together and killed the damned thing. Mum would be proud. Now the Inquisitor received the Emperor's blessing in a more direct fashion than usual, and Charles was determined to ensure his friend and mentor would get all the help and support he needed. He was doing precisely that, ensuring the safety and well-being of the child who was instrumental in destroying that warp-spawned monster. Even thinking about it sent a tingle of phantom pain in his missing arm. "You want to do what, Lieutenant?" "And who exactly signed off on your orders?" Weber demanded. His first reaction was to call the idea preposterous. On second thought, it might have some merit. He knew from his mother and her sisters that Imperial saints needed faith to function best. This might just help a bit. A Photoshop for propaganda purposes. It might help distract the citizenry too. The raving crowds are proving a constant disruption all over the city. Lieutenant Regina bobbed her head in excitement, swaying her shoulder-length blonde hair. "Get a crew ready. I'll talk with the Lord Inquisitor and Celine. Make sure they're polite and respectful at all times, or I'll make sure they rue the day they were born," Charles promised. "They will be, Commissar, sir." The woman snapped a smart salute, grinning like a loon. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. Charles got to a nearby Vox operator and called the Inquisitor, explaining the situation. That might help. Getting to the spaceport and back was a chore, and you saw what happened at the field hospital. Throwing something else to the citizens to look at might help. Do speak with the propaganda department. We need some organization here, and that's their job. Have them liaise with the local churches as well. "That's an excellent suggestion, sir," Weber happily agreed. The Inquisitor won't be disappointed. He headed inside the current safe house, looking at the guardsmen around like a hawk. For once, they appeared to be handling Celine's presence in commendable fashion. Would miracles never cease? Better not. He found Celine intently watching an educational video featuring the Sisters of Battle. It was not only appropriate, but made him feel pride bursting in his chest, despite the uneasy sensation of his spine trying to crawl away. "Celine, come here, dear." Charles smiled and forced his arm to be steady as he patted her shoulder. "A few fine people from the propaganda department want you to pose for pictures. It will be almost as fun as that time with the crowd yesterday. You'll get your armor and kneecapper, and I'm sure we'll find some sweets and cocoa. How about it? Do you like to show off?" Those large, unnerving eyes stared straight at his soul as if trying to devour it. A moment later, the effect lost its potency when Celine grinned at him and nodded vigorously. "That's a good girl. Come on, let's get you ready." Soon enough, Celine wore her pristine armor, courtesy of the Mechanicus. Now she had a small camouflage cape to go with it and carried the blessed power mace over her shoulder with only a bit of visible effort. "She is magnificent. People will love her," Lieutenant Regina squealed. Her smile wavered when she approached Celine. However, she didn't waver and went to one knee in front of the girl. "Hi, dearie." The junior officer still sounded bubbly. Charles re-evaluated his opinion of her. The young woman was made of sterner stuff than many veterans. "Do you want to come with us to the nearby park? It will make for some great pictures." "And as promised, Jamie over there," Regina pointed over her shoulder, "has some fresh sweets and hot sweet tea." Weber glanced at why, and sure enough, there was a frazzled-looking corporal with a paper bag, thermos, and cups. It was a delight to work with competent people instead of having to shout at them to do their emperor-damned job. They might just get this planet in order yet. Selene looked at him, and Charles nodded. She beamed and skipped along with her new friend. The lieutenant stood up, shuddered once, then shook herself and followed suit, still smiling, and it was only a bit forced if Weber was any judge of people. This time, they could get somewhere without having to brave huge crowds, and it was refreshing. The park was mostly empty, void of mobs or guard equipment. There were even a few couples with children playing around. Naturally, everyone stopped what they were doing and gathered to a safe distance to watch the show. From that far away, children and parents alike pointed excitedly at Selene. If the rumors were true, she would become almost as famous as the Inquisitor among the citizenries of Kronus. Speaking of Selene, she was still skipping happily, while cameras recorded her and took countless pictures. After a few minutes of playing, Lieutenant Regina coached the girl with bribes of warm sweets. The point was to convince Selene to make a few heroic poses that would undoubtedly go on propaganda posters all over the planet. It was a job well done if he said so himself. Selene was happy, and thus the Inquisitor was going to be happy as well. Charles smiled at the sight of children jumping around, pointing excitedly at Selene and making exaggerated gestures as if smiting traitors. Recruitment wouldn't be a problem for Cronis anytime soon. Unfortunately, someone had to rain on his parade. Static went through the air, putting Charles on edge, and he signaled the security detail to pay attention. Without even thinking things through, he went for his charge. One moment, everything was right in the world. Then a warning wail shook the whole city. Necron drones decloaked, proving that the Mechanicus and everyone else had grossly underestimated how many of the damn things buzzed over the city. At least a few hundred of the damn things converged on their position like scores of falling stars. Charles ran for what little it was going to do, barking useless orders. Selene's Necron minders phased into existence, but instead of grabbing or attacking her, one of them pushed the child into Regina's arms. "Run, fool!" the Necron screamed. In a blink of an eye, the other one had its blade in hand and barely parried a strike that sliced through its gun, taking off a hand in the process. One of the largest Necrons Charles had ever seen stepped out of thin air, and in a blink of an eye sent the one facing it flying in pieces. The other Necron charged at the interloper only to be batted aside, missing an arm in an attack Weber's eyes couldn't even see. The Commissar was still in the process of drawing his chainsword and gaining speed when the rogue Necron reached Regina and threw her away with a swift motion. He could only helplessly watch as the intruder's clawed hand was about to close around Selene's shoulder when a drone rammed the machine, sending it stumbling a step back. At least 10 more ploughed into the Necron, to much less effect, while the converging swarm opened fire, raining emerald lighting or what looked like particle beams at the attacker. They were wailing all the while, making sure Charles couldn't hear the desperate orders he was screaming. The Necron ignored the shots hitting it. Its form shimmered, and they either passed through or dissipated nearly harmlessly. It ran at Selena, who just stood there, staring at it in shock. A few las bottles splashed over metal flesh. Then one of the bodyguards was up, almost intact, despite being dismembered moments earlier, and it managed to slow down the assailant for a few precious moments. As soon as that Necron fell, the other was between the hostile and Selene. The newcomer wasted no time and tore an arm off the last thing standing between it and its prize, then kicked off the legs of the loyalist Necron, literally. The smaller machine crashed on the ground, and the large one went to grab Selene again. This time she reacted and swept at the metal fingers approaching her with kneecapper. At the same time, another drone slammed into the intruder, smashing into its face and disintegrating during the impact. Green lighting fell from the clear sky, and at least 100 large and heavily armed Necrons surrounded the park. They didn't waste any time taking stock of their location and actually ran towards the engagement. It all happened in less time. It took Charles to cover the 20 or so meters separating him from Selene. The damaged bodyguard, fallen at the feet of the attacker, used its sole remaining arm to grab at them, slowing it down. The other bodyguard was up again, missing one arm and chunks of its torso. Instead of going on the offensive again, it ran, grabbed Selene, and sped away. At the same time, at least 100 drones rained upon the rogue Necron. Before the intruder could reach Selene again, it faced a phalanx of living metal and a forest of glowing blades. "Thief!" All the Necrons screamed as one and charged the interloper. Charles barely managed to stop himself from ploughing straight into the melee. Part 2. Victory Bay. Cronis. Fine, let's negotiate. First, please answer me this. Where is Selene? Who the hell is the thief? And what is he doing on Cronis? Inquisitor Vale glowed with golden power while he visibly restrained himself. Herald of Victory was in a similar state. He might be a Necron lord, and he might lack many of his memories, However, he could experience emotions now. It didn't matter if it was a bug of a feature after spending so long asleep. Trazyn trampled his honor again, and that would not stand. He is Trazyn the thief, and his suffering will be infinite, Herald of Victory explained. What my fellow planetary overlord is saying is that Trazyn the Infinite is a thieving wretch wanted by dozens of dynasties for absconding with all kinds of valuables. Amarkan translated. While understandable, his colleague's anger might be a bit counterproductive. Or perhaps not. It might be a bonding point to help cement the alliance. Amarkan had his reasons to loathe Trazyn, many of them in fact. Today he had to add another one. After such a disgraceful display, honor demanded restitution, thus weakening their bargaining position. They couldn't even take proper credit for saving the little pariah. It was a Necron attempting to take her, and good luck convincing the humans to be grateful. They might be primitive, however they weren't completely foolish or ignorant. At least these particular humans weren't. Any attempt to play up the rescue might be logically interpreted as a setup to gain an upper hand in the negotiations, thus backfiring spectacularly. Damn Trazyn and his thieving ways to long and protracted death. May his necrodermis rot and his joints break. Your pariah is en route to this location under heavy guard. Given the circumstances, we are not risking Trazyn intercepting a displacement attempt. We surprised him once, we aren't relying on surprise again, Amarkan added, while his fellow lord still fumed and screamed at Trazyn to come out and die all over the Necron network. It was a pity that the thieving bastard would at best send one of his infamous body doubles, though smashing another one of those might feel good. You haven't put him down or imprisoned him, why exactly? The new Inquisitor asked shrewdly. Unfortunately, all things considered, an assault on his stronghold would have cost too many valuable assets at a time when we fought the war in heaven. Right now, such an assault, even if successful, would be crippling. Trazyn the thief rules over Solomase, what you would call a Dyson sphere. It possesses heavy defenses. A direct assault would require a strategic effort which simply isn't feasible at this time, Amarkan explained. He wasn't making a startling revelation. The humans were aware that no matter how advanced the Necrons were, their numbers were limited, which was one of the primary driving forces behind these negotiations. That's regrettable, Vale grumbled. Unless we know for a fact that he has stolen strategic Imperial assets, we won't be able to muster sufficient forces for dealing with him, no matter how we might like to. Doing so would be a misappropriation of resources. We share your frustration, human. It has plagued us for longer than you can imagine. We might only hope that either one day the thief will misstep, or the strategic situation would shift enough in our favor to make an assault on Solomase viable. If that day comes, I will be honored to fight by your side again. Herald of Victory finally got his rage under control and demonstrated he had become a planetary lord for a reason. I share the sentiment along with the rest of the Neferu dynasty, Amarkan declared grandly. Even Firon Kefrek the Unbroken might stay his hands long enough to work with primitives if it meant delivering a meaningful blow against Trazyn. Or not. Tsar of Tomorrow might be right, and that was a depressing thought on this particular occasion. Because of the thief's dishonorable actions, we're prepared to offer you a few concessions. Under most conceivable circumstances, our directives would require to remove any trespassers from our worlds in a most expedient fashion. I understand you've encountered our kind before, and it has been under adverse circumstances. This is one of the most likely reasons. They saw you as threats and interlopers upon awakening and acted appropriately. Herald of Victory explaining truthfully, it just wasn't the full truth. Cronus, my domain is different. First, it is not a full tomb world, but a well-defended research center. Second, after fighting together against common enemies, honor demands we observe certain courtesies. Further, the despicable conduct of the thief reflects ill upon every Necron in the galaxy. That much we can accept, Inquisitor Vale said more calmly. His wings relaxed, even if his form still glowed with a very odd form of trans-dimensional energy. Given recent events and the bond we hold forged in combat, I am prepared to allow continued human habitation upon parts of Cronis under certain conditions. If nothing else, the humans were mortal. The Necrons were immortal. They could simply wait for the human presence on Kronus to naturally die off, even if it meant mostly ignoring them during a general conflict with the rest of the primitives. Herald of Victory raised a hand and called an image into existence showing the continent. The Thur Abyss Plateau, as you know it, is mine. My facilities there are now almost fully operational, properly defended, and if it makes the rest of your kind feel better, I can keep the area permanently concealed. Herald of Victory began his part of the bargain. The Vandamar Mountains, the western mountain parts of the Pavonian Heartlands, and parts of the western Badlands contain some of my facilities below the surfaces. Those areas lit up with green, and the symbol of the Silent King's own dynasty. Amarkon was very glad he decided to tread carefully and use diplomacy instead of a more forceful attempt to gain an advantage in this system. If or when the Silent King returned, a heavy-handed approach could have spelled a disaster. The humans looked at each other. It might work, practically speaking. While the territory you hold cuts off direct travel to many regions on the continent, it leaves plenty of alternative routes to ship people and supplies. From what I gather, those are some of the safer roads too. Provisionally speaking, such an arrangement might be acceptable. Vale nodded thoughtfully. We might have to offer some concessions to the locals to avoid future trouble. In that regard, the female smirked at Vale. A sermon or 10 from their new saint might help smooth ruffled feathers. The Necrons watched the exchange with interest. From what they gathered so far, wings and feathers weren't typical among the humans. However, this exchange pointed that such a conclusion was either incorrect, or that the wings held some importance they haven't been able to properly discern yet. Figuring out the primitives was proving a more complicated task than anticipated. As long as I have your backing when the ecclesiarchy arrives in force, we'll have to convince them to behave, or else any agreement we reach might be threatened. Vale compromised. Our understanding was that you two, as Inquisitors, have unparalleled authority among your kind. Is that correct? Amarkon asked for clarification. Everything they could dig up pointed at that conclusion being the right one. In theory, and most cases in practice, this is correct. In our particular case, you being aliens from our point of view, dealing with you falls under the purview of Ordo Xenos, our branch of the Inquisition, the female explained. In practice, the situation on Cronis is particularly complicated and will cause problems no matter what we do. Humanity has been under siege by hostile aliens for more than 10,000 years. That might be a blink of an eye to you Necrons, but to us it has been an eternity. Mistrust and hatred of the alien are ingrained among most of our people. Any alliances with aliens have been temporarily affairs. Almost always, the Xenos had betrayed the spirit or letter of those agreements sooner rather than later. We will need more than our word and theoretical authority to make an agreement viable. A most dishonorable state of affairs. The few species we could occasionally work with are the Eldar, enough said there, or the Tau, the blue aliens still controlling important parts of this continent. Vale pointed out. The same aliens who allied against us. Herald of the Void nodded once in understanding. He quickly bounced a few ideas and alternative stratagems against Amarkon. Put in that context, the humans' madness made a bit more sense. Their situation almost appeared like a mirror of what the Necrons faced during the War of Heaven. Besides the obvious fact that they lacked allies back then, they could work with this. Before the Citan, before the first defeat that led to their doom anyway, the Necron tier were alone, besieged from all sides by a superior enemy. That was almost the same situation the humans found themselves stuck in. Back then, their former selves would have taken any offer of help, or perhaps not. Fear and hatred were strong motivations. They could understand them and work with them. In view of recent events, I will offer assistance in removing the Tau from Kronus. Further, the preliminary analysis leads us to believe that those aliens do have technology equal or superior to what your forces deployed. While we won't claim that they are more advanced than your Imperium, it might be prudent to capture as many technological examples and industrial facilities as practical. That way, your cryptech equivalents, the tech priests, could study them and figure out if they might provide feasible upgrades. We're ready to assist in both capturing Tau technology and reverse engineering it for your use." Herald of Victory declared happily. That and the gifts they had for Inquisitor Vale would go a long way to satisfy their honor. Chapter 15, Parts 3 and 4. Chapter 15, Our Enemies Bring Us Together. Part 3, Victory Bay. Cronis. Facing Lychguard wasn't anything new for Trazyn, however doing so without proper preparation has been something he usually tried to avoid. Because really, how could he know that a small horde of them, from 2 different dynasties at that, would come after him? He wasn't liberating unappreciated art or history from Necron vaults. He was merely trying to recover and preserve a relic, perhaps get some company to the silent sister he had on display. From what he knew, knowing humans, the pariah child would be safer and happier as part of his collection anyway. Who in their right mind wouldn't? She even exceeded his expectations, somehow managing to cripple his arm with the relic he came to retrieve. That mace was even more valuable than anticipated, and he had to have it on display. But first, Trazyn had to deal with a spot of trouble. Teleporting out wasn't working. He tried. There was a powerful interdiction field over the whole area. He lacked the necessary clearance to bypass it, and a quick and dirty attempt to hack the local Necron network faced unexpectedly stiff resistance. That much he almost saw coming. A number of the Lychguard doing their admittedly very good best to dismember him wore heraldry designating them as sworn to the Silent King. That might lead to some uncomfortable questions in the future. Fortunately, that particular boar wasn't around right now, so the Collector could worry about him later. Much later. Trazyn waved, shot, cut, stabbed, and smashed his way through. He was making a progress, however, it was too slow. Even his specially designed expedition chassis began to suffer unacceptable damage. An irritating amount of drones floated around, shooting at him, even ramming him, which was simply not the way you did things. It wasn't considerate. They also provided a powerful jamming field, cutting off unauthorized communications. Usually Trazyn would have had the codes to bypass such a defense, or his assets ready to jump in and deal with those pests. He had such assets waiting on standby. He couldn't call them, and they were laying low to avoid detection by the local Necrons. Reluctantly, Trazyn had to admit to himself he had been a tiny bit too eager to get himself some relics, also too dismissive by the local Necrons. That wasn't exactly a happy state of affairs. He blasted the face off a particularly persistent Lychguard and unleashed all available mind-shackle scarabs he carried. It was time to get serious and out of here. The Necrons surrounding him slowed down and spluttered. He broke through, only to notice they rather quickly began to recover. And instead of intercepting the more mundane Necron units going after him, every single one of them staggered in his direction. Trazyn didn't like the way they glared at him and slurred his name. It was unbefitting and unbecoming. And getting caught might be hazardous. For some strange reason, they didn't seem to like him, the barbarians. Trazyn let out a sigh, and his shoulders slumped. It wasn't faked at all. He had to spend one of his precious relics to get away. That simply didn't happen to him. Oh well, it hadn't happened in some time, but that wasn't important. Things like that weren't supposed to happen at all. More drones came at him screeching nonsense about thieves. He knew already the Bloodravens were disreputable, magnificent hoarders. Why he got himself several new exhibits from their strike cruiser. With the utmost regret, Trazyn placed an arm into one of his pocket dimensions and fished for the right tesseract labyrinth. A particle whip struck his shoulder while a Gauss shot found purchase into cracked platting. Cracked fingers slipped over an artifact. Trazyn's shoulder seized when a Lychguard materialized beside him and struck before his damaged body could properly respond. That was bad, and you should feel bad, the Collector snapped. As he did, a beam lanced from the symbol on his forehead. It burned its way through the head of the Lychguard. Predictably, when he tried that on the next pest, a hyperphase blade met the energy beam and deflected it into the sky, where it sliced through a few of those irritating drones. The next time he came here, Trazyn swore he would bring a few holds full of his best tiny machines. Then he would show those uncultured brutes what a real swarm was. A spluttering and seizing arm managed to get a hold of 2 tesseracts. He reflexively threw them out, sending the command to activate as soon as they hit the ground. At the same time, Trazyn pushed as much power into his chronosphere as possible. It was time to make himself scarce before overwhelming numbers could fully converge on his position. Next time he would send a fake body or 10. No, better be 20. A large catachan devil landed upside down, crushing many lich guards. Welp, he should have taken the time to put back the pieces he had been rearranging when the distress call came, Trazyn decided. On the other hand, this was going to be enough of a distraction. What was in the other labyrinth? Trazyn's sensor registered a small group of humans stumbling out among an ever-increasing number of screaming Necron warriors. He could almost appreciate the irony. Well, no matter, he would have to come back to return them to their proper place in the gallery. Or perhaps he would replace them with a fresher group. But first, he had to outrun the angry mob. That never got old. He made tons of friends that way. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax stumbled from one slice of hell into another. A glance around offered little reassurance. Dozens of abominations surrounded them. Even if she had her loyal bodyguards with her this time as well, they were of little help against that many of the Xeno's menaces. As if that wasn't bad enough, a huge insect-like monster thrashed nearby. Probably the reason why they found themselves out and about, no matter for how fleeting a moment it might be. To me, kill as many of them as you can. Katarina screamed her fury, her throat raw of disuse, and drew Tyrant Slayer. The stormtroopers wasted no time and aimed at the nearest Xeno, and neither did she. Greyfax's finger caressed the trigger of her Condemner bolter. It had served her well against countless traitors and heretics. It was much less useful against these abominations. Katarina couldn't press the trigger. Her stormtroopers shook, held their ground, but fired not a single shot. What kind of xeno-sorcery was this? How could her hand betray her? She tried again and again, suffering the same result. All Greyfax could do was scream her hatred at the abominations. Perhaps that was the answer. The Xenos were ignoring them, focusing on the beast for now. The Inquisitor snarled, and caring little for the consequences, something she would no doubt later regret and curse herself over, drew power from the warp. She was surprised she could reach into the immaterium and draw on its power. The Xeno abomination was sure to deny her even this. Greyfax staggered as if struck across the face with a metal gauntlet. The warp was the calmest she had ever experienced. It was too calm, impossibly calm. And as if that wasn't warning enough, a cage of light surrounded everything she could perceive. The immaterium might have been calm, but it wasn't empty. There was an abomination of another kind nearby. It glowed like a beacon with the same energy surrounding her. It suddenly moved, and Katarina hurriedly cut off her connection just as she felt the demon's awareness brush over her. What insanity did that Xeno menace do this time? What depravity did it unleash? Move, let's get out of here. Useless or not, Greyfax didn't want to spend what little reprieve the illusion of freedom offered surrounded by the Xenos. We're with you, Inquisitor, her bodyguards croaked, their voices cracked from disuse, just like her own. The Xenos ignored them, and they soon broke through. For the first time, Katarina laid her eyes on the surrounded area and blanched. That abomination had taken a piece of Imperial City. There were men, women, and children running away. A small cluster of guard stood impotently between the citizens and the Xenos. They couldn't fight either, Greyfax concluded. The abomination was taunting and torturing them all with their helplessness, damn it forever to the deepest, most terrible parts of the warp. Halt! A furious commissar missing an arm roared. Katarina barely heard him over the Xenos' screams of rage. She nearly smiled. The man was properly paranoid, for what little good it was going to do any of them. The troopers behind him aimed their weapons at the Inquisitor and her bodyguards, and this once she couldn't blame them. She would do the same and more if she was in their shoes. Part 4. Victory Bay. Cronis. Katarina stabbed Tyrant Slayer into the ground and raised a hand to pinch her cheek. Cold, armored fingers touched her clammy flesh, and she could feel the pain. It didn't help. The commissar, Weber, was speaking, explaining the situation. Greyfax heard him, knew the words coming out of his mouth. They just made not a shred of damned sense. They weren't back into the abomination's lair. but instead on an imperial world besieged by Xenos, traitors, and heretic. Demons, too. Or it had been if the madness Weber spouted held a shred of truth. Katerina was sorely tempted to raise her bolter and blow his head off. The man was clearly unhinged by the terrors he had faced. A sad fate that, however, no one was protected from breaking save for the Emperor. Despite her instincts screaming at Greyfax to discharge her duty, she kept listening. Weber was almost happy to condemn herself, and Katerina guessed she owed him that much. To her, his confession properly before bringing the Emperor's justice upon him. He might have been a good man once, after all. Not everyone she had to shoot or burn had been a depraved traitor from the start. A few were even factually innocent, merely unwittingly condemning themselves with their actions. The Inquisitor picked up her power blade and held it in a death grip. They stood at the edge of a now ravaged park, watching a group of Xenos fight that huge insect-like monster. She gleefully observed how it crushed a few of them like empty cans, and its scythes proved a match for their accursed metal flesh. They ceased their abominable screams, and Katerina was almost glad for the end of the oral assault. Unfortunately, the beast picked up where the other Xenos left, screeching, snapping, and hissing in a very disturbing manner. The metal abominations lashed at it with a blade and lighting, stripping armored plates and exposing the tough flesh beneath. It still refused to die and continued to struggle, lashing back at everything in sight. An almost reassuring form of a predator tank rumbled from a nearby street, painted red. A few Adeptus Astartes ran behind it, carrying heavy weapons. To Greyfax's stunned disbelief, they opened fire on the beast as well, instead of using the distraction it offered to cut down the more dangerous abominations. Did those things manage to compromise even the Space Marines? The tank didn't bother slowing down and opened fire with rapid-firing cannon and heavy bolters. Explosive ordnance bit into exposed flesh, shaking the beast, who let furious death cries. It skittered with surprising speed for something so big and spouting such wounds as it did. It managed to trample two more abominations before a pair of missiles struck it. One slammed into its exposed and shredded chest, while the other went into its screeching mouth. The following two detonations splattered smoking ichor all around and finally put down the monster. Then the Xenos looked around, and most of them left, taken away by offending lightning bolts. Those who remained merely stood guard, but didn't move towards any of the humans. After everything she had suffered, Katerina couldn't believe it. What new torture did the abomination intend now? Offer them false hope? Pit them against the demon she sensed for its amusement? The tank took a position at the edge of the park. Its cupola began to rotate left and right, scanning for threats and ignoring the abomination just like they paid no attention to the Astartes. All but a single Space Marine flanked the machine, providing infantry support. The last one walked towards them with long strides that ate the distance in no time at all. "Commissar Weber," the Astartes nodded in respect. "I'm Brother Tarkus. Please explain the situation. Where is Asset Celine? Who took her?" "I'm pretty sure one of her Necron minders managed to get her away just in time." The broken commissar kept spouting madness, further damning himself. Before they left, Celine managed to get that bastard in the hand with kneecapper. He proudly declared, "Good girl." The Astartes nodded in agreement. "What madness is this?" Greyfax hissed. The commissar was bad enough, however, he was a mere mortal man. The flesh was weak, the soul easy to tempt. But an Astartes, they were made of sterner stuff. "Elaborate, madam, and please introduce yourself. As I said, I'm Brother Tarkus, Tactical Marine of the Blood Ravens 1st Company, deployed to Kronus, under the field command of Captain Damien Thule. I'm Inquisitor Katerina Greyfax." She introduced herself coldly and raised a hand showing the symbol of her office. "Now we have 3 Inquisitors on site, if the rumors are true," the Blood Raven said, unperturbed. Katerina hadn't heard of that particular chapter, though that didn't say much. There were a lot of them, and new founding did happen often enough. Besides, there was important information those two let slip. There were supposed to be more Inquisitors caught in this snare. "I don't know what rumors you've heard, Brother Tarkus. However, Inquisitor Vale is with Inquisitor Vale, who arrived earlier today. They're at the General's HQ, discussing how to handle negotiations with the Necrons tomorrow. He nodded at the Inquisitor and her bodyguards. They appeared along with that beast during the attack. The intruder escaped in the confusion. Greyfax bristled at the very idea. Those two had to be from Ordo Xenos. Thankfully, there were precious few Inquisitors from other branches with the gall to treat with Xenos, especially such abominations. If you excuse me, Madam Inquisitor, I need to find out the state of my charge. I vowed we wouldn't misplace her again. Weber offered a crisp salute and turned away, ignored Katarina. She had had enough and raised her bolter. Commissar Weber, in the Emperor's name, I pronounce you excommunicate traitoress. The sentence is... Greyfax trailed off. She stared at the large bore of a bolter, one held by the Space Marine as if it was a toy. Many of the guardsmen nearby had their weapons aimed at Katarina and her retinue, while the stormtroopers returned the favor. Are you a traitor as well, Astartes? If anyone is a traitor here or compromised, it might be you, Madam Inquisitor. You just appeared under suspicious circumstances. If anyone needs to be examined and judged as a potential traitor here, it is you and your group, not a man who, not a few days ago, fearlessly charged a horde of demons at the side of Inquisitor Vale. Tarkus declared coldly. Smoothly, the other Astartes turned around and aimed at Greyfax and her retinue. Moments later, the tank followed suit and several Necrons approached. Is there an issue? One of them calmly asked. A few of them. First, what is the status of Celine? The Commissar demanded, caring not that he was a trigger press from death. Safe and on the way back here under heavy escort. What about them? The abomination looked at Katarina with its sinister glowing eyes. That remains to be seen. You people saw how they appeared. The Commissar had the gall to shrug. The thief released them from a tesseract labyrinth. Conclusion. He had stolen them some time ago and chose to use them as a distraction. However, they were smart enough not to engage our forces. Were they? The traitorous Commissar raised an eyebrow at Greyfax, who was moments away from blowing his brains off, and damn the consequences. What in the Emperor's name is happening here? A man bellowed. It was a miracle, really, that no one pressed the trigger then and there. Well, not in Katarina's case. She froze for an instant, feeling the treacherously deceptive light of the demon brush over her senses. Greyfax looked to the right and saw it. It wore the visage of an ordinary man, twisting it with a pair of large glowing wings. Golden radiance covered its form, betraying the witchcraft saturating it. A blonde woman in a form-fitting costume walked beside him, and both of them were flanked by large abominations, with a lot more of the Xenos marching behind them. Was this the abomination's game, taunting and torturing them by shoving in their faces how many servants of the Emperor it had corrupted? Inquisitor Vale, the traitor Commissar, saluted the winged demon, an act that would have signed his death sentence if he hadn't condemned himself already. Chapter 15, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 15, Our Enemies Bring Us Together. Part 5, Victory Bay, Kronus. The moment of hesitation cost Katarina dearly. An abomination moved in front of the traitorous Commissar, shielding him. She gritted her teeth, cursing herself for allowing such weakness to creep within her. She should have shot him already. That way, at least, she would have rid the galaxy of one more traitor, even if it was the last thing she did. Because right now, when abominations and traitors surrounded them on all sides, the absolute best they could achieve would be suicide, and the abominations weren't merciful enough to let them die. Charles, I need answers now. What little patience I had left is now an exhausted resource, the demon hissed. This is Inquisitor Greyfax. Apparently, I'm a traitor now for working with aliens and upholding the alliance you brokered, sir. The traitor answered promptly. By all accounts, the Lady Inquisitor has been a captive of the entity that assaulted us in an attempt to kidnap Celine. There are indications that she and her retinue are compromised. Despite the way they appeared, and possessing many reasons to consider the Necrons hostile, they didn't fire a shot. Ah, hypocrisy, mental subversion, or plain stupidity. Which is it, I wonder? The demon taunted. That's interesting. One of the abominations declared, "I'm detecting mind shackle scarabs in them. Further, my scanners are highlighting an anomaly with the woman. She bears traces of long-term stasis technology exposure, much longer than the rest. They've been exposed for about 4 to 5 centuries. Without more invasive scans or specialized scanners, I'll have to guess. She's been in stasis for about 9,000 of your years, with an error margin of 10%. The abomination lied. There are anomalies. She might have been released for short periods before being frozen again. Inquisitor Greyfax, I'm Inquisitor Amberly Vale, Ordo Xenos. Even without the input by Herald of Victory, the way you arrived at Kronus puts your mental integrity in question. I'm compelled to request your surrender for medical examination and interrogation. If you don't comply, we'll have to subdue you. Preferably non-lethally. That thief caused enough chaos. We'll be doing him a favor if we kill each other while he is running away. The demon wanted them alive to torture them. Typical. Inquisitor, I request you stand down. The Astartes demanded as well. Katarina's arm shook while impotent rage made her see red. She wasn't compromised. Her mind was the only thing that abomination hadn't destroyed. She put everything she had into pressing the trigger while aiming at the face of the Xeno shielding the traitorous commissar. Her flesh betrayed her. Was this the demon's influence or the abomination's? Inquisitor, we can't shoot at them. We're trying. Her chief bodyguard whispered, distress and hatred coloring his usually stoic voice. The obvious conclusion crashed over Katarina. She was compromised. They all were. The only question was by whom, but it didn't matter now. There is only one way left for us, Sergeant. We live and die for the Imperium. In one quick motion, Greyfax pressed the barrel of her bolter under her chin. The Astartes were already moving, but they wouldn't make it in time. Her finger caressed the trigger once again, and to her immense frustration and fear, she couldn't pull it. The blood raven was upon her then, and her world became an approaching red fist, before winking out. This happened, Vale grunted. Seriously, fuck my luck. Now, Charles, please go retrieve Karam from where you and Scipio stashed him. He might be unable to keep his mouth shut to save his life, but he still is the best Magos biologist we have left. Consult with Scipio and get us whoever else among his boys and girls have experience with mind control devices and have them report to where you'll put the prisoners. Amarkon observed the unfolding situation with interest. At the same time, he gleefully dedicated a part of his awareness to watch again and again a recording of recent events. The pariah child hitting the thief on the fingers when he tried to steal her was deliciously ironic. Not to mention glorious. The little pariah deserved a gift for that alone. And a permanent security detail. While unlikely, they might just catch Trazyn while trying to take her again. At worst, they might be able to keep foiling him, which would be its own reward. If the thief managed to get the pariah anyway, then Amarkon knew how Vale would react. He was sure that Inquisitor Vale would do his best to deploy as many human forces for a raid on Solomis as he could arrange. That was a win-win situation, no matter how you looked at it. The recording of a primitive child foiling Trazyn with a melee weapon was going to be priceless. This was a very good day, despite the thief's appearance. The only downside was that now they had to offer even more concessions to the humans. All because that never-sufficiently damned thieving wretch took the Necron's honor, stabbed it in the back, shot it in public, then landed a monolith on it. At least watching Trazyn's fingers shatter was kind of soothing. It was really nice, all things considered. A brief exchange with Herald of Victory ensured they were on the same page as far as the pariah was concerned. Now it was time to continue the negotiations and begin repairing the damage the thief caused. We're ready to provide cryptech support in removing the mind shackle scarabs from your fellow humans, as well as find out any present mental conditioning and reverse it, Herald of Victory said. I'm sure Magos biologist Karam Beta 31 and the other Medicais will appreciate the offer, Vale said. They'd better, he added quietly. Amarkon found himself agreeing with the human. Further, because of this kidnapping attempt, we're ready to provide a permanent security detail for the pariah child Celine. They'll attempt to capture or neutralize the thief Trazyn when he makes another attempt to steal her. The odd energy readings surrounding Inquisitor Vale spiked, and the golden glow surrounding him became almost blinding for a few moments before subduing. It was an interesting phenomenon, one which revealed that their sensors needed a bit more hardening and calibration against trans-dimensional energies. I can provisionally agree to such an arrangement. We'll have to discuss the details later. Vale kept proving he was surprisingly wise for a primitive. On a related note, there is a standard offer of a reward to anyone confirmed preventing the thief Trazyn from conducting another successful robbery. Amarkan continued. Through her actions, the pariah child Celine earned herself one such reward. We'll offer appropriate compensation as soon as feasible. That should win back some goodwill, surely. And there were indeed many standing rewards aimed at foiling Trazyn, even if they weren't appropriate in this case. I'm certain Celine would appreciate a gift or two. Vale bargained well. I'll see it to it that Inquisitor Greyfax and her retinue are properly secured. Inquisitor Vale came back to their group. I propose we continue negotiations later this evening after tempers cool down and we've taken a proper stock of the situation. Besides, we do need time to consider your generous proposals. What she said, Vale agreed. That is acceptable. I'll have Cryptex Tsar of tomorrow available for consultation. I'll have my best Cryptex ready to assist well. Foiling Trazyn is its own reward, Herald of Victory added. Part 6. There was one dubious benefit to incarceration. It left you in peace and quiet to run simulations on the topics that interested you. While not as good as actual hands-on research, it wasn't like Karam had the free time for that. There were too many busy bodies around, not to mention all the people who got themselves torn up, and someone, like him, had to put back together. That at least wasn't that bad. There were so many interesting wounds and other assorted injuries caused by exotic alien weaponry, radiation, toxins. Combat and its aftermath could be precious sources of data. And when you were one of the persons putting the guards back together, they tended to appreciate it and do more than usual to keep you alive. That was as good a deal someone like him could get these days. Such arrangements had saved him before, and imprisonment notwithstanding, saved him again. Karam doubted that if he hadn't been vital to patching the Inquisitor up, Vale would have been merely content to leave him to his own devices. Instead, he might have had Karam shot when the Margos tried to share what he learned. The typical arrangement proved useful once again. Just after a few days of peace, the guards let him out. People needed his expertise, as expected. Karam dutifully followed and stretched his electronic senses around. The noosphere, as pathetic as it was on Kronus, was abuzz with news. An alliance with the Necrons was in the making, one of a more permanent sort. While it was unlikely they had to offer much that would interest him, the prospect of getting his hands dirty did make him happy. The more new technology, alien or not, there was to distract his colleagues the better. That way, the other tech priests would be even more likely than usual to leave him alone. Karam's guards led him to a field hospital with heavy security. There was at least a regiment busy digging in, along with a lot of heavy equipment. Swarms of the Necron drones filled the sky. A large number of their warriors patrolled the area, scanning for threats as well. That was enough to confirm what he already deduced. Someone important got themselves blown up, or worse, and he would have to stitch them back up. Doing so was usually trivial, but still important. The Magos biologies passed by several choke points and under the searching eyes of many scanners. Finally, he reached a large, mostly empty operating room. An unfamiliar human woman stood by the operating table, flanked by 3 colorful and very large Necrons, who barely fit into the operating theater. A man in blue-tinted carapace armor laid strapped in securely on the table. Perhaps he had to keep a prisoner alive for interrogation. He hadn't done that lately. Karam Beta 31, the woman demanded. Yes, he answered simply and to the point. Inquisitor Amberly Vale. She raised an arm that was hidden by her body, showing her symbol of office. Karam sent an inquiry and got back valid codes. Lady Inquisitor, he bowed. How can I be of assistance? We have a group of soldiers and a fellow Inquisitor under the influence of alien mind control technology. They might have been subjected to further mental conditioning. Brainwashing, she meant. You want my aid to reverse the process? Karam perked up. This was new and exciting. He already liked this Inquisitor. Inquisitor Vale recommended your talents, and here we are. Karam had to concede that the young Inquisitor might not be so bad after all, even if he overreacted over the Magos merely doing his job. These are Cryptek's Tsar of Tomorrow. The Inquisitor pointed at the largest and most ornate machine, Seeker of Truth, that was the closest and smallest one. And last but not the least, Cryptek Novice of RK. They're familiar with the technology in question and will offer their expertise in removing it. Corporal Victor Sentenza here volunteered to be the first subject you'll work on. I'll leave it to you. You'll have access to any resources you need within reason. The Inquisitor left with those words. Greetings in the name of the Omnissiah. Karam decided that being very polite might be in his best interest. What do we have to deal with? Mind-shackle scarabs. The largest Necrons spoke in a surprisingly normal-sounding, not to mention polite and erudite voice. A crystal-clear hologram appeared above their patient, showing the man's insides in incredible detail. The image zoomed in on the head, briefly flickering through skin and bone until it showed a deep scan of the brain. It was a real-time projection of what was happening inside right now. While Karam had worked with blessed medical equipment with similar capabilities, it tended to be rather large and quite rare. There wasn't a single example on Cronis. Perhaps the Astartes apothecaries had something like it on their ship in orbit. What got Karam's attention in particular were the thousands of glowing green machines within the brain, most of them in the cortex region. They had no business being there. We need to get those out while keeping the subjects functional. Tsar of Tomorrow stated the obvious. The usual countermeasures we have against them will prove messy and fatal if used on something as fragile as mere flesh and blood. Karam nodded, while silently agreeing. It was surprising, or perhaps not, that the Necrons shared the Mechanicus' disdain for mere flesh. They had discarded it, after all, he had to remind himself. Those three were prime examples of what the tech priests saw as the pinnacle of evolution. He vowed to ask some leading questions about how they achieved such a feat while working on the current project. Necron Stronghold, the Therabis Plateau, Kronus. Necron facilities rose from the ground, casting long shadows. A veil of artificial clouds saturated with energy and tiny machines provided cover from aerial and orbital observation. It would also shred most airborne treats that attempted to pass through and would disperse energy weapon strikes offering additional protection. Drones and simple-minded warriors busied themselves with clearing up the area, making it properly presentable, not that the facilities themselves were active and well defended. The sight alone almost made Amarkan content. The multiple weapon emplacements ensuring they wouldn't be taken out of orbit surely helped in that regard. Herald of Victory phased through the ground and offered him a sphere. Here it is, a hard copy of the data we agreed to share. The Nemesaur would have smiled if he still could. He interfaced with the well-protected data repository. An exchange of all the necessary codes followed. Then he had to pass an additional authentication process before finally gaining access to the data. His filters went on overdrive while he scanned the information and got a copy within his memory. While he wasn't a Cryptek, Amarkan was familiar enough with how their technology worked to conclude that everything appeared legit. Data on anti-warp pylon research, including the schematics and research notes for multiple models with different effects and capabilities. Data on War in Heaven pariah research, which indicated interesting parallels between ancient Necron efforts to counter trans-dimension entities and phenomena and the human pariahs. Scans and a stealthily taken blood sample from the pariah child Selene proved the commonality further. What was the relationship between the Necrons and the humans? That was yet another thing they had to investigate. Next was data on other assorted null-tech research, which would provide marginal to moderate upgrades for the Neferu dynasty. Finally, he received raw combat data and military analysis of encounters with trans-dimensional entities falling under the designation Chaos Forces. When all was said and done, Amarkan in particular and his dynasty in general would profit mightily from answering the call for help. In exchange, they were going to provide military support, access to resources from orbital mining, and most importantly, naval support and transport. It was more than a reasonable exchange for what Amarkan already gained and might yet gain from future research conducted on Kronus. A problem that had always plagued research in countermeasures against trans-dimensional incursions was the lack of willing subjects with access to abilities fueled by such energies. In the fullness of time, the alliance with the humans might change that and offer new insights. The bargain is well struck, Nemesor Amarkan the Gatherer. Herald of Victory declared after Amarkan confirmed he received what the planetary lord promised. Bargained well and done, Herald of Victory. They sealed the exchange with ancient words, which while mostly fallen out of use, were still important to many. Then it was the turn for the more modern and binding exchange of digital signatures and long code sequences. Do you have anything to add about tonight's negotiations? We have an accord about the goals we'll pursue and the restitution we'll offer. My cryptex have the gifts finalized. Mine as well. There was little more to say about tonight. The Necrons spent the rest of the early evening discussing the implications of Trazyn being active for at least 9,000 years. The number of artifacts he might have stolen in that time and their origin. It was concerning to consider what else he had taken from the humans and how they might react if they became aware of the thievery.